Good evening, everyone. This week's Parsha is Parshas Beha'alotcha, Option Pei Aleph. I'd like to dedicate this shir in memory of my mother, Mrs. Shalom Rabinowitz, Shalom Espas Rav Yaakov Eliezer. So this week's Parsha, we have the mitzvah of Pesach Sheni. And the Torah tells us that in the second year of the Jewish people leaving Egypt, before they left Egypt, they brought the carbon Pesach, the Paschal sacrifice, on the 14th day of Nisan, where the animal is slaughtered on the 14th day, the blood is sprinkled on the 14th day, and the meat is eaten on the night of Pesach, the 15th day of Nisan. And they were commanded, Hashem told Moshe, the Jewish people should bring the carbon Pesach in the desert, which they did. The Torah then tells us, this is Parak Tes Pasuk Zayin, chapter 9, verse 7, actually in verse 6, that there were people who were impure, people who were tamei. They had come into contact with a dead body that makes them tamei, impure, and they weren't able to participate in the carbon Pesach because of that. And Pasuk Zayin, verse 7, tells us, Vayimru anoshim ha'ima elav. And these people said to Moshe, Anachnu tve'yim l'nefesh adam. We are impure from a dead body. Lama nigara. Why should we be diminished? L'vilti akrivas karban Hashem, to not be able to bring the sacrifice of God b'mayadai in its time, b'serech b'nei Yisrael, amongst the Jewish people. They were saying, why should we be left out? We're impure, but why should we be left out? Now, a little background is important here before we get into discussing what exactly was their claim. But some background about these people who became impure. Who were they? How did they become impure? There's a little bit more than just it happened. This is the Gemara Sukkah, Chavhei Amud Aleph, 25a. And the Talmud says that these people, the Gemara says, who were those people that were impure? They were the ones who carried the coffin of Joseph. The Torah tells us that before Joseph died, is at the end of Bereshis, or the book of Bereshis, Yosef makes the Jewish people swear that when they leave Egypt, they have to take his remains with them. And they did so. And actually, they carried his remains through their 40-year sojourn in the desert until they came to the land of Israel and buried him in Shechem. So the people that were impure were the people who were carrying the Ark of Yosef. That's when they became impure. If that's the opinion of Divrei Rabbi Yisrael Glili, these are the words of Rabbi Yisrael Glili. Rabbi Akiva Omer, the sage Rabbi Akiva said, Mishav al tzafan hayu sheyoiskim anadav aviyu. The people involved, these people who were tamei, were two men named Mishal and Al-Tzafan. And in Parshas Shmini, we read that Aaron's two sons, Nadav and Avihu, brought the Ketores, the incense, where they weren't supposed to, in a manner they weren't supposed to, and they were struck down and killed inside the Mishkan itself, in the tabernacle itself. And Hashem told Moshe to tell two men, Mishal and El-Tzafan, who were actually Mishal and El-Tzafan, who were relatives, right? Who were relatives, they were cousins of Nadav and Avihu, that they should take out those bodies. They should be the ones to take out the bodies of Nadav and Avihu from the Mishkan. So because they had carried out those dead bodies, they became impure. These were the first people coming and saying, why should we be left out? The third opinion of Rabbi Yitzchak is, that's the sage Rabbi Yitzchak, is that actually these were not people specifically involved in some kind of an episode that we know of, but rather it was people who had to be involved with a mace mitzvah, meaning they were involved in a situation where someone had died. People died in the desert. They had no one to take care of them. There was no one to take care of them. And therefore, it's an obligation of anybody who can to take care. It's called a mace mitzvah. There's a special mitzvah to take care of a person to be buried who has no one to bury him or take care of him, has no family to take care of him. So the people who came down to Moshe were people who were involved in taking care of a mace mitzvah, of a person who had died who had no one, no family to take care of him, and more. And what happened was like this about these people. specifically going on these people. When a person comes into contact with a dead body under the same roof as a dead body, they become tamei. How do they become tar again? How do they become impure again? So the answer is they need two things. They need to be sprinkled with the water of the Parah Aduma. Parah Aduma, the red heifer that was burned, mixed with spring water, and sprinkled on a person who had become tamei through a dead body. There's no way for a person who became tamei from a dead body to become impure without the waters of the Parah Aduma, which is why nowadays we are all considered impure from a dead body. So you need that to be sprinkled. Specifically, the Torah tells us that sprinkling has to take place the third day after you are impure, after you became impure, and then the seventh day. That's when the sprinkling takes place. And after being sprinkled on the seventh day, you go to the mikveh, and then by the following evening, meaning the next day, right? The day in Jewish law begins at night. The next night, they're considered pure. These people, says the Gemara, were people that become impure because they're involved in the mitzvah of a mace mitzvah. Someone had no one to bury them. They became impure, and the seventh day after becoming impure, which was the day that they would have their final sprinkling, was Erev Pesach. That day when the carbon Pesach was to be slaughtered and the blood sprinkled, and the following night be eaten, that day of the slaughtering of the Paschal sacrifice which is the Erev Pesach, the 14th day of Nisan, that was the seventh day of these people's process of purification, which means that on the day of Erev Pesach itself, on the day of the slaughtering of the Paschal sacrifice, they were not yet pure, but the following night they would have been pure. And we'll get back to that. But this is some background that we need to know that the Gemara tells us about these people. And the common denominator, whichever way you learn who they were, there's a common denominator between them. They were all involved in a mitzvah. The people carrying the Ark of Yosef were involved in a mitzvah. They were giving the proper honor to Yosef that Yosef asked for. If it was Mishal and Safan who carried the bodies of the you, Hashem told them they should do it. A third explanation, they were involved in a mace mitzvah, a person who didn't have anyone to bury him. In all three examples, they're involved in a mitzvah. Now, the question is, they're coming to Moshe, and they're saying to Moshe, why should we be left out? We should also be able to bring the carbon Pesach. And Moshe says to them, good point. I'm going to go ask Hashem, and I'll come back and give you an answer. It's very obvious why they couldn't bring it. They themselves say why they can't. They are impure. And everybody knows, and everybody knew, that if you're impure, you can't bring a sacrifice. That's the way it is. You cannot come into the Mishkan. You can't come into the Mishkan if you're impure. You cannot come into contact with a sacrifice if you're impure. They understood why they couldn't bring it. So what was their complaint? What was their claim? What were they saying? At the end of the day, they were impure. If they were impure, they couldn't bring the carbon. What more is there to say? And what's the big question that Moshe has to say? I'm going to go ask Hashem. I'll come back to you. So there's two ways how to approach what their claim was. And it's really going to kind of depend on the different answers and on the explanations of the Gemara as to who these people were. So the commentary of the Arach Chaim gives an answer, and the Sefornu in his commentary gives a similar answer, that they understood why they couldn't bring the carbon. But what bothered them and what they came to say to Moshe was, we're impure from doing because we did a mitzvah. And as Sefornu says, mitzvah is supposed to bring about mitzvah goreris mitzvah. We have a principle in Pirkei Avos. One mitzvah brings to another. A mitzvah shouldn't be the reason why you can't do another mitzvah. And that's exactly what's happening here. And more than that, a little bit of halachic basis. The halacha is, and everybody understood, that if you're impure, you can't bring the carbon Pesach. Understood. But let's say you have a situation where the majority of the Jewish people became impure from a dead body. The Gemara talks about a case where the leader of a generation dies, his funeral is Erev Pesach, everybody goes, everybody becomes impure, what happens to the Karban Pesach that year? The answer is that there's a principle. Tuma hutra b'tzibur. Impurity from a dead body can become permitted when the situation is that the tzibur, where the community, the nation, has become impure. If the majority of the Jewish people are impure on Erev Pesach, they're going to bring the Karban Pesach in a state of impurity. That's the halacha. Which means that we do find a case where tuma, impurity from a dead body, which essentially is supposed to invalidate a person bringing a Karban Pesach, there are times where Hashem says, no, you still could. There are still times where you can be impure and bring the Karban Pesach. So therefore, says the Ohr HaChaim, the Jewish people said, look, there's already a situation where Hashem permits the Karban Pesach to be brought in a state of impurity. We're impure because we were doing a mitzvah. We shouldn't be different than them. We should not be different than the majority of the Jewish people who for some reason become impure from a dead body. We should not be any worse than them. True, we're not the community, we're individuals, but we were doing a mitzvah. That's when we became impure. And it doesn't make sense that a mitzvah should be the cause of not being able to do another mitzvah. And there is already a premise of tumah, of the period of a dead body, from a dead body, not being not being a hindrance to bringing the Karban Pesach. Well, why aren't we being given that permission? So again, they weren't coming from a halachic argument because they understood that they were impure, and they understood that being impure as an individual does not allow you to bring a carbon. But nonetheless, their claim was that, look, but why are we not being able to bring the Karban Pesach? What is the purity? Where did the purity come from? It came from a mitzvah that we were doing. If it came from a mitzvah that we're doing, then why should we lose out on a mitzvah? It doesn't make sense. One mitzvah should be a cause to lose out on another mitzvah, especially when we already see that there is a concept of being tameh, of being impure from a dead body, and bringing the Karban Pesach. Moshe understood their very deep and sincere desire to do the mitzvah. He understood how they were arguing, making an argument and asking for permission to be able to bring the Karban Pesach even in a state of impurity, with the explanation that they gave. And he understood that's a worthy point that's worth bringing before Hashem. Now, the Ohr HaChaim says another little bit different twist, that they said, let us bring the sacrifice like everybody else on the 14th day of Nisan, Erev Pesach. Or at least, they said, there is a concept that when a person, in the times of the Beis HaMikdash, when people had to come, they had to come to Yerushalayim, to the Beis HaMikdash on Yom Tov, every person had sacrifices that they had to bring. It was a personal obligation on each and every Jew to bring these sacrifices. Now, everybody couldn't bring them on the day of Yom Tov itself, right? Don't forget, on Pesach, you've got, again, according to Torah law, you have one day at the beginning of Pesach that is Yom Tov, and then you have the seventh day. Sukkot, you have one day that's Yom Tov, and then you have Shemini Atzeres, the eighth day. Shavuos, you have one day, and that's it. Everybody can't bring their sacrifices on the day of Yom Tov itself. And therefore, the truth is that they actually had a week to bring their Karban Pesach, to their Karbanis, starting from Yom Tov and 6 days plus, and in the case of Sukkot, because of Shemini Atzeres, 7 days, they actually had a span of either 7 or 8 days to bring those sacrifices they were obligated to bring. And even on Shavuos, when it's only one day of Yom Tov, they had another 6 days to bring their sacrifices. So the Torah allows a person, when they can't bring the carbon on Yom Tov itself, they have the rest of it, they have a whole week afterwards to be able to bring it. So their point was that, again, because of the fact that we were doing a mitzvah, shouldn't be a reason for us to lose out on the mitzvah. So either we should be permitted to bring the Karban Pesach with everybody else, or if for some reason it doesn't work out that we can't bring it on that day itself, what about give us the rest of the week? Let's have the rest of the week. Let's have the tashlumin. Let's have the makeup time to be able to bring the sacrifice. Right? We have the sacrifices that you have a whole week to bring. So let us do that. Let us do that. And this was what they came to request from Moshe. Moshe brought the request to Hashem, and Hashem said, look, you can't bring it on Pesach, but you can bring it on a month later on the 14th of Iyar, which is called Pesach, Sheni, the second Pesach. Not on Pesach itself, not in a state of impurity. You can't bring in a state of impurity. The Korban Pesach cannot be run in a state of impurity, even though we find in the case of the community becoming impure that they could. That's only by a community. It's not going to apply by individuals. You cannot bring the Korban Pesach on Pesach for everybody else, but you will be able to bring it at a later point of time after you become pure on the 14th day of the year. That was the response. So that's one way of learning what was their claim, that they should be able to bring a korban. And because of that sincere request, they merited to bring out this mitzvah, a Pesach Sheni, which says if a person was impure Erev Pesach, or he was too far away from the Beit HaMikdash on Erev Pesach to bring, on the day before Pesach, to bring the Paschal sacrifice, that a month later, they'll be able to bring it. A month later, they'll be able to be pure and stay pure until then, and then be able to bring the korban. Bring the Paschal the Korban Pesach, the Paschal sacrifice. So that's one approach. If we follow the opinion that says that we're talking about people that were involved with a Mesa Mitzvah, they were involved with someone who had no one to bury them. And as we said, the seventh day of their purification, the seventh day of after becoming impure, which would have been the day that they get sprinkled for the second time with the paradim of the red heifer water. And by night, they should be pure. They would be pure. If we follow that explanation, then the commentaries say they made call it a halachic argument. An halachic argument. They argued like this. Look, you're right. On Erev Pesach, on the day that the Korban Pesach is to be slaughtered and the blood sprinkled, we're tamei. We're still tamei. Okay? But in essence, okay, so what? We're not going to do the sprinkling of the blood itself. A Kohen does that. The slaughtering of the animal, we don't have to do it ourselves. Somebody can do it for us. So why not have the animal slaughtered for us and the blood sprinkled, the blood of our Korban Pesach, our Paschal sacrifice be sprinkled while we are still officially impure. But by night, when we become pure, then we can eat the meat. Clearly, part of the obligation of the Korban Pesach is to eat the meat also. So it can work. The animal will be slaughtered on the seventh day while we're still impure. The blood could be sprinkled while we're still impure. And then at night, when we are pure, we'll eat the Korban Pesach meat like everybody else. So why can't that work? Why can't we do that? They understood that as being impure, there's a rule you can't bring a korban if you're impure. Typically, you can't partake of a korban if you're impure. So they understood that they were not being allowed to be the Korban Pesach because they were impure, but they argue with Moshe. But why? Why can't it be that the animal will be slaughtered and the blood be sprinkled on day 7 of their being impure, the day that they are sprinkled for the second time from the waters of the Parah Adumah? They could be in a state of impurity. Why should that affect the slaughtering of the animal that they get, of the sacrifice they're going to be part of? Why should it affect the blood sprinkling of the animal they get of the animal that's going to be their Korban Pesach? They'll be in a state of impurity, and at night they can eat it because they'll be pure. And the truth is that they argued again, and we find something similar to that. We find a situation where a person can actually be impure, but the animal to sacrifice is brought for him. So, for instance, there's the sacrifice called a korban chatas, a sin offering. Person unintentionally committed a sin, they bring a sacrifice, they bring a korban chatas. Now, let's say they're impure. So the halacha is, as long as the animal is alive, the animal doesn't become impure. They can go ahead, give the animal to someone, have it slaughtered, have its blood sprinkled. When it comes to a sin offering, the person bringing the sin offering doesn't eat the meat, the Kohanim do. And that's what could happen by a korban chatas, by a sin offering. The owner can be impure. The animal can be his sacrifice can be slaughtered. Its blood can be sprinkled, all while he is impure. And the Kohanim who are pure, they're going to eat the meat. So we have such a we have such a setup where you have the slaughtering and the blood sprinkling being done for someone who is impure, the meat that has to be eaten will be eaten by the pure people. And so they said, Korban Pesach should be the same. We can do the same thing. Just in our case, the animal will be slaughtered when we're impure. The blood will be sprinkled when we're impure. And the next night, when everybody's eating the Korban Pesach, which is when you're supposed to eat the Korban Pesach, we'll be pure. We'll eat from it. And they made what's called the Kal V'chomer, which they said, look, Korban Chatas, Korban sacrifices fall into two categories. Kachim Kachim, the Holy of Holies, those are at a higher level of sanctity. And the other Kachim Kalim, those are on a smaller level of sanctity. The difference between the two, one difference between the two is that when it comes to Kachim Kachim, the meat has to be eaten within the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash, or the temple or the Mishkan of the tabernacle. Kachim Kalim, those that fall into the category of, on a lesser level of sanctity, can be eaten throughout Yerushalayim. A Korban Chatas, a sin offering, falls into the category of Kachim Kachim, of Holy of Holies. The Korban Pesach is Kachim Kalim. It's the more lighter of the holy of the sacrifices. It's eaten all over Yerushalayim. So they said, if we find the setup by a Chatas, which has a higher level of sanctity, that even when a person is impure, the animal his carbon can be slaughtered, and the blood can be sprinkled, and the eating of the meat will be done by those who are pure. So Korban Pesach, that's Kachim Kalim, it's on the lesser level of sanctity. The setup should be worked there too. The animal will be sacrificed, the blood be sprinkled for the owners while they're in a state of impurity, and by night, when they're pure, they'll eat from the meat. That was a halachic argument they were making with Moshe, to Moshe. And Moshe said, it's a good point, good argument. Imdu, wait here and let me go speak to Hashem. And when the answer came back, no, it's, whether the argument makes sense is a good argument. At the end of the day, Hashem says, the Korban Pesach doesn't work that way. You cannot have the Korban Pesach being slaughtered and the blood sprinkled while the owner is in a state of impurity. Can't happen. But it will happen. It will happen, but you will be able to make up for it a month later on the 14th of Iyar, which is Pesach Sheni. So these are the explanations given to the argument that they made why they should have the ability to do it. At the end, Hashem says you can't do it, but you will have another chance, and that chance will be on Yud Al Iyar, on the 14th day of Iyar. You will have your chance to actually to bring up to do a makeup Korban Pesach that you missed on Pesach itself. Now, just want to share with you an interesting Gemara. The Gemara, it's actually from what's called the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud. Now, when we refer to the Talmud, we're typically referring to the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, the Talmud that was written in Babylon, Babylonia, I'm sure way you say it. Then there was a Talmud Yerushalmi, the Talmud that was put together in Jerusalem. The Talmud Yerushalmi poses the following question, the following scenario. That scenario is, Nitin li Yisrael livnais habeis habechira. If permission was given to the Jewish people to build the Beis HaMikdash, so what happens like this? It means, the case is, Pesach, we didn't have a Beis HaMikdash. Permission was given for the Beis HaMikdash to be rebuilt between Pesach and between the month of Nisan and the month of Iyar. So by the time Pesach Sheni comes, we have a Beis HaMikdash now. Oh, so now let's all bring a Pesach Sheni, because we couldn't bring the Korban Pesach the first time around. We had no Beis HaMikdash, we had no temple to bring it then. But now that we have it, we should all bring it on the Pesach Sheni. So the Gemara says it's an argument. The Gemara cites an argument of the sages of the Talmud. One says that we know as a rule that the tzibur, the community, the nation, doesn't bring a Korban Pesach Sheni. As we said, if they're impure on the 14th of Nisan of Erev Pesach, and the majority of the Jewish people are impure, they could go ahead and they could bring a Korban Pesach even in a state of impurity. But let's say, for instance, the whole nation became impure not because of a dead body. They became impure from some other source of impurity. Somehow or another, they all touched the sheretz. They all touched one of the creeping animals that makes them tamei. They had some kind of emission from their bodies that make them impure. Then they cannot bring the Karban Pesach on Erev Pesach. This permission of bringing a Karban Pesach in a state of impurity only applies to the impurity of a dead body, does not apply to other impurities. And even when Pesach Sheni comes along, they won't be able to bring a Pesach Sheni. The Pesach Sheni was given to individuals, not to the tzibur, not to the nation. And therefore, in this case, where they didn't have it, where the situation was not that there was a Beis HaMikdash, but they were disqualified to bring the sacrifice. They didn't have a Beis HaMikdash, nonetheless. The first opinion cited in the Talmud says that Pesach Sheni was not given for the community, for the nation. It was given for individuals. And then the Talmud cites Rabbi Yehuda, who says, no, Rabbi Yehuda says that we actually find a story in Tanakh of such a thing where the king Chizkiah, because the Beis HaMikdash had become impure, and it wasn't going to become pure for Pesach, and for some reason he didn't want to go through working with the idea of, well, in such a state of impurity they can bring it anyway. He didn't want to rely on that. He saw that situation where the Beis HaMikdash was impure, like a situation where we don't have the Beis HaMikdash, we don't have the temple, and therefore he said, and it wasn't like necessarily the sages agreed with him, but he held that now everybody can do Pesach Sheni, everybody can bring a Karban Pesach, Pesach Sheni. That year, Pesach is going to be in Iyar, not in Nisan. And there's a whole discussion exactly what was the basis of why he did that. But Rabbi Yehuda, the sage Rabbi Yehuda says, look, Chizkiah had the whole nation being the Pesach Sheni, and therefore, in the situation where there was no Beis HaMikdash Pesach time, and now by the time Pesach Sheni comes, we have the Beis HaMikdash, the whole nation would bring the Karban Pesach. So that's an argument. Now, this case of where the Jewish people given permission to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash, what's that referring to? So truthfully, there is a medrash that brings down that there was such an event that took place, that the Roman government gave permission to Jewish people to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. The Kusim, the Kuthians, a group of non-Jews who lived in Eretz Yisrael at the time, who made lots of problems to the Jewish people, convinced the Romans to kind of alter, to tell them, no, you can't let them build the Beis HaMikdash. The Romans said, well, we gave them permission already. So the Kusians said, here's the solution. Tell them they cannot build it on the same spot as before, or they cannot use the same dimensions. And then they'll say, no, can't go, doesn't go, won't work. And that's what they did. It almost sparked a rebellion on the part of the Jewish people, the Medrash says, if not for one of the sages who calmed them down. But you do find such a concept where the ruling country gave permission to rebuild the Beis HaMikdash, and they were going to do it. The question is, if this were to happen between Pesach, between the month and between Pesach and Pesach Sheni, would that now create a situation where the nation would now bring the Karban Pesach on Pesach Sheni? And there's that argument. And it seems that according to some of the commentaries, this theoretical situation, which nowadays it doesn't work for us to rebuild the third Beis HaMikdash because we're impure. So it's not going to work. But if in a situation where it could have worked, Rabbi Yehuda was of the opinion that the Jewish people will bring the Karban Pesach on Pesach Sheni as a nation. And it seems from some commentaries that that's who we follow. His opinion is the opinion that will be followed. The Minchas Chinuch, when a commentary called the Minchas Chinuch, he says that, if the Beis HaMikdash would be rebuilt between Pesach and Pesach Sheni, we would bring a Karban Pesach as a nation. And he says, I'm writing this between the Pesach, I'm writing this in the period between Pesach and Pesach Sheni, and he prays that the Beis HaMikdash should be able to come back in this period of time, the coming of Mashiach, so that we should be able all to bring the Pesach Sheni on Pesach Sheni. Well, we're kind of past that right now. But as we are discussing this, and as we're discussing about this possibility of the Beis HaMikdash be rebuilt, could we bring a Pesach Sheni? It brings us to mind that we should be hoping that Mashiach should be coming sooner than next year, Pesach Sheni, and we should be able to have a Beis HaMikdash and bring the Karban Pesach on Pesach, and not have to come into this question. But that's our prayers. Let the Beis HaMikdash be built speedily in our days and bring us only salvation and joy and peace for the entire nation, for the entire Jewish nation, and for the world. Have a wonderful evening.